Hi, I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is Conservation Connection.
Presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
We run a wildlife education nonprofit focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day around the country.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
Join us each week to discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet. Alrighty guys, welcome to another episode of Conservation Connection. We are so excited to be here at Columbus State University. We are here in the room with Dr. Troy Keller, who is a professor of environmental science.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so glad to have you here. So we have a whole range of things that we want to talk with you about. You do a lot of work with stream ecology, looking at sort of the ways that people use the water and interact with the river, right?
I do. I've been fascinated by streams since I was knee-high to a grasshopper.
Well, that's a great place to start. So let's back up and ask, where are you from and kind of how did you fall in love with stream ecology?
Yeah, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the rural areas outside of the main city, along several important rivers. Big Darby it became a national scenic river, and I grew up as a boy fishing and swimming in the river. So I have very, very fond memories of rivers, and that's what structured my whole entire career.
I love that. So from Columbus, Ohio, and now you're in Columbus, Georgia. Is that a coincidence? How did we get here?
It's a funny story, but the footnote to that is that when I was offered the job here in Columbus, I called my sister, who lives in Columbus, Ohio, and mentioned to her that I had been offered a job at Columbus State. Now, there is a Columbus State in Columbus, Ohio, of course. And my sister was so excited. She said, "Oh, all of my prayers have finally been answered." And I responded that she needed to be a little more specific in her geography because It turns out that there is another Columbus State University, and it just happens to be in Columbus, Georgia, not Columbus, Ohio.
Which, Columbus, Georgia is a very interesting location, geographically speaking, being this close to the fall line, right? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with our section of the Chattahoochee River right here, right?
Absolutely. This is one of the more unique areas because you have at least 3 or 4 significantly different ecosystems all sort of occurring in the terrestrial realm, plus you've got a river sort of flowing through there, and that river may be literally millions and millions of years old. So there's some really fascinating history and geography that's going on here in the Chattahoochee Valley.
And for those of you listening that may not be particularly familiar with our area and what I mean when I say the fall line. So we're here in Georgia. We've got mountains at the north side. We've got a coast at the southeast section. And so there's this gradation in elevation. As we go from mountains, then we go to what's called the Piedmont, which literally means foothills, right? Foot of the mountain. And then we go to the coastal plain. So the fall line is where there's this drop in elevation over a very short distance. And it goes from being these hilly Piedmont area to the coastal plain that slopes all the way down to our coast. And so Columbus, Georgia, in this section of the Chattahoochee is right in that area where it's making this transition from the Piedmont down to the coastal plain.
Yeah, and that's a really important point because much of what happens both historically, economically, everything with Columbus is based on that fact, right? Because that change in elevation means that there's a lot of power in the river, which is why there were historically dams constructed here so that they could run the mills. It was the head of navigation. So you could take a boat essentially up to this point, but then you have all these falls that you couldn't navigate up any farther. So there's lots of, geologic reasons why we have the geography that we have. This is why this is a really good place for native peoples, and then after the native peoples, the more current European settlers.
I think it's always interesting when we talk about stuff like this where people always feel so disconnected from nature. I'm going to go visit nature. I'm going to go leave my house and go hiking. And we talk about these topics and you realize that nature I mean, the way that the land and the water is laid out and has been laid out for millions of years is why you are where you are today. This is why there is a city in this region, and it's because of the ways in which our landmass was formed oh so long ago. I love remembering that fact because it makes me feel so much more connected to the world around me.
It's absolutely a really great point. And I think, if you just look at the map of the city and sort of how it's laid out, it's even that sort of structured, where the homes are, where the homes are not, right? All of those sorts of things are so dependent on that geography and sort of what geologically has happened in the very, very distant past. And so, we have a legacy. It's not a random process going on here, right? There's real method to the madness.
You spoke a little bit just now about the history of the river here and the native people who used to use it. How much of that history goes into the research that you do currently?
So my lab doesn't do a lot of that sort of work, but of course, we are particularly interested in conservation and restoration. And so those are topics that really kind of come upon a really important philosophical question, which is, what are you restoring to? Like, what is your goal? And oftentimes that comes to this question of like, well, what should we aim for, right? Do we aim for pre-Native Americans, right? Or do we aim for what Native Americans had done? Because we're learning now that Native Americans had very significantly altered the landscape and manipulated ecosystems, for instance, the longleaf pine ecosystems with burning. And that was a really important process that sort of created the ecosystems that we inherited or took over. And so it's a really relevant question that's in the back of our mind, but it's not something that we're directly doing research on.
Which it's just the question of like, what is baseline, right? What are we trying to get back to? Because Earth and every system on Earth is constantly changing. And it depends on what timescale you're looking at, what kinds of changes you're going to see. But the only constant is change when it comes to Earth systems. And so that's not something that we talk about a whole lot, is like, what are we restoring to? And I think it's very important to keep that kind of in the back of our minds.
Yeah. And, there is debate about that, right? I mean, it's not a clear-cut goal. Everyone says, oh, we want to restore the stream. And then the question is, well, to what? Another field of research is also looking at to what degree can you restore something. So maybe we'll get into that later in the podcast, but it is worth noting that not all ecosystems can be restored to what they had been previously or to some other ecosystem state. And so that's an interesting problem in and of itself. It's sort of like knowing how far can you fix a home that's dilapidated or something, or do you have to basically start from scratch? And, that's an ongoing challenge, and it really depends on the context. And for rivers, it's really important to think about the watershed, because the watershed is all that land that basically makes the river what it is. And so if the watershed has been heavily modified, that can sort of affect what you can do with your restoration efforts.
Obviously, the river didn't always have all of these dams. That's something that was man-made somewhat recently in our history, but you do a lot of dam research. So can you dive into some of that for us? Tell us, what exactly are you looking at with the dams in this area? And are you specifically looking in our area in Georgia, or are you also looking in other states and places?
Yeah, most of our research is focused sort of in the southeast, and I would say it's targeted spatially in Georgia, but it applies to pretty much all the southeast and even to some degree the northeast as well. Let me just take a step back quickly, if I will, just to remind your listeners that dams have lots of human purposes, right? We build them for a reason, oftentimes either to build up the water pressure behind, and we can use that as power to power a mill or to maybe mitigate flooding or any number of other drinking water source, all sorts of things. But they also block and sever rivers. So rivers are, if you want to think of them like sort of networks of capillaries in your body, if you block them off, then obviously that has a significant impact on sort of the ecosystem itself and the critters that live in there. But also going back to that watershed concept that we talked about before, if you block off rivers with dams, then portions of the watershed behave very, very differently than they would have historically. And so that connection between different segments of the watershed actually gets sort of severed. So the work that we've been doing is partnering with the Nature Conservancy, and they own some land around Fort Benning, and they are doing some restoration work on some of the many, many dams that exist in the state of Georgia. And so they were interested to find out, well, if we remove these dams, what sorts of benefits are we going to get? Like, what can we expect to see if we go into our properties and we invest money to try to remove dams that historically were created prior to us owning this land? And so what we've been doing with a large number of students, we've been going in and actually trying to get into the water and measure what are the direct impacts of removing that. So we did some pre and post dam removal studies, and specifically what we measure is changes in water quality, changes in the biota. So the organisms, the animals respond to these changes in very significant ways. And we're interested to find out, well, if you remove that little blockage, does that then open up the opportunity for reconnecting populations of organisms to be able to migrate back through those areas where they would not have been able to do that historically?
I don't think people realize quite how particular aquatic animals are about the microhabitat in which they live. I mean, there's so many parameters that go into living in the water. We're talking about flow, temperature. We're talking about how clear is the water. Is it acidic or is it basic? Does it have a lot of dissolved minerals in it? Does it have no dissolved minerals in it? And each of those parameters, especially for aquatic organisms, I guess it's important to remember that a lot of aquatic organisms don't have the same separation of exterior and interior parameters the way that we do walking around on land. We have this lovely adapted skin that keeps our water inside of us and separates us from our environment. And a lot of aquatic organisms don't do that, right? So the water that they're living in directly passes over their gills or gets involved in some of their other membranes. And so these really tiny changes in water chemistry or the physical characteristics of the water completely alter what organisms are or are not able to live in that area. So when you're talking about removing a dam, that's going to have a huge change on stuff like flow rate, how is silt being deposited, stuff like that. It really can wildly swing the types of organisms that are able to live there. And the reverse of that is true when you're putting in a dam, right? So when they put in those dams originally, is going to completely change, have cascading effects on what is able to survive in that area.
Yeah, this is really, really important point. You know, I teach a course called Stream Ecology, and one of the big sort of meta ideas or theories, if you will, is this idea of flow, right? What makes streams unique is the fact that they have essentially this concept of unidirectional flow. So material comes from one place and it is transformed as it's moving through the system. So when you stop that system, you create a pond, right? A wetland or some sort of stoppage. And all of those transformations that would typically occur in a stream now change to a pond environment. And there's a whole suite of other organisms that live there, just to your point. And so it's really fundamental that we think about that. And most people, they just enjoy having a pond. You know, they can go fishing there, they can stock it with different fish and so forth. So they recognize that there's a difference between a pond and a stream, but understanding what causes that connection, and it's all those points that you raised about the fact that once we have eliminated that flow or altered that flow in a significant way, there's a cascading effect on all of those other physical parameters that determine where the organisms and which organisms are going to be where. And of course, we're also worried about sort of, you can really get deep down into the genes of the organisms and say, well, now if we separate these organisms, they literally get separated from one another and they can't just walk out of the water and make their way around that pond. So now you get this separation of genes and you can have isolation and extinction and all sorts of other conservation concerns.
That's a really important point, because one of the safeguards against extinction in a population is genetic diversity and being able to spread those genes across the entire population. But, you know, if you have a stream and you cut it into 10 segments, you now have 10 separate populations with 1/10 the genetic diversity that they had before. So any small change in the environment is much more likely to cause an extinction of the entire population in that part of the stream than it would have previously.
Absolutely. And, you know, that genetic diversity also prevents things like inbreeding depression and all sorts of other things that everybody knows are bad things, right? We recognize that inbreeding is a problem. Well, we don't want that in our stream organisms either, right? We don't want to start losing those organisms or having weird mutations or something that are occurring that are causing some serious problems for even the things that eat them, right? I mean, maybe you don't really care so much about tiny little crayfish, but maybe you do care about the birds that eat those crayfish or the fish that eat those crayfish. And so it's sort of that whole cascade. These, all things are connected in ecosystems. And when we create these dams, we sort of sever those connections. Now, dams themselves are not inherently bad, right? I mean, it's just basically stopping water. And there are organisms like beavers, for instance, that create dams. And those can be extremely empowering and helpful to ecosystems that are adapted to that kind of alteration. But beaver dams are, on the orders of 10s or 20 years. They tend to be much smaller. There's a really very different ecosystem processes that are going on in beaver dams than behind human earthen dams, for instance. And so not directly comparable. I just want folks to know that not all dams are bad.
Right. And here in Georgia, our largest non-carbon based power source behind nuclear is hydroelectric, right? That requires us damming the river to build up pressure so that we can pass that water through a turbine, spin a magnet, and create electricity. Dams create carbon neutral electricity for us, but they also have major impacts on streams. So it all boils down to this sort of give and take that is at the heart of everything environmental science. Do you want to dam the stream or do you want to have carbon neutral electricity? And so that's why we need researchers to look at what are the quantifiable effects of these issues so we can make informed decisions on what is the best way to move forward.
And I think one of the things that my lab is really focused on has been sort of the things that really nobody is paying very much attention to. Sometimes those are the most interesting stories, which are as you get farther and farther away from the river, right? So remember, the watershed is contributing rainwater onto land, and then it's making to little streams that get to bigger streams that eventually come to the Chattahoochee River. And that's what makes the Chattahoochee different sizes at different points. As you get a larger watershed, the river gets bigger. It's capturing more water. And so one of the things that we've been studying are these sort of headwater streams, these first and second order streams. They're really small things, right? They're the little creeks that you could jump over when you were a kid and you might turn over rocks and things. Those streams are the most numerous. They're the longest streams in any watershed network, but they also are the ones that are the first ones that are affected by human activities because they're small. You can just, fill them in. It doesn't make any you don't even need a dam in most cases. You can just bury those things. And so what people have done in many places in the South is they blocked those up and made little reservoirs out of them, and they've had some utility. But now, with what we are learning about the importance of those systems, the question is, if we start removing those, can we then really reconnect and start developing populations again and reconnect that genetic diversity and do all the things that we would like to see in a normal, fully functioning watershed?
Your research may just be on these smaller dams, I'm not sure, but I want to get into that a little bit more because I've seen removal of dams happening more often, and I haven't been able to look in it too much yet. But my question is, obviously, you're going to get a lot of pushback from people who, use these dams or who live south of these dams. So is any of the research you're looking at with big dams? And if so, how does a removal of one of those big dams impact the towns or the people who have built up since those dams have been in place and they haven't had such big water flow?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. That really hits the sort of social side of the dams, right? They provide all kinds of benefits that we've already talked about. And so removal of dams, well, let me step back for a second. Changing anything. Humans don't deal well with change, right? I mean, I just, raising my hand here, change my cereal in the morning, upsets my whole day, right? So we don't deal well with change in general. And when people have sort of built infrastructure around something like a dam, alteration of that dam or removal of that dam can have very significant consequences, both economically and socially. So for instance, if you have marinas that have built up on these dams and people are fishing out there and having tournaments and doing all that sort of stuff, they expect a certain thing. You remove it, obviously that's going to change things. So one of the things that you have to do when you're thinking about sort of in these large river-run dams, you have to really work with the public. It's very, very important, and there can be some very significant pushback. What I have found interesting is that at the same time that people who want the reservoir side, right? So they like the dams, not because of the dam themselves, but because of what it does. It creates a reservoir, a pond, a lake, if you want. And Georgia doesn't have a lot of natural lakes, so those lakes can be important for people to recreate on. I get that. If you're going to do these kind of projects, one of the things you have to do is spend a lot of time talking to locals, finding out what those organizations are doing, and find out ways that you can sort of redirect their attention toward what are the benefits you're going to get once this thing is gone, right? So in this region, just to hit one example of that, the removal of a lot of these dams is going to create incredible new habitat for shoal bass. And since that is it's a native bass, it's an incredible fishery, that will be something that I think you will see people travel all around the country to come participate in that activity. I think you're going to see sort of a shift in sort of the recreation that will occur. But it is not an easy sell, and then oftentimes it requires, just like anything, any kind of change, we have to make a lot of efforts to really focus on the people who are going to be affected.
That's a really excellent example of a phenomenon that we call the triple bottom line in environmental science, right? Where a solution has to be good for the environment, 1, for the people, 2, and for the economy, 3, the money, right? So the environment, the people, and the money all have to work in order for everybody to get on board with a solution, right? So when we're talking about removing a dam that was previously the site of a fishing tournament, if you remove it and you're not telling people that by removing this, you'll actually have an increased access to a native bass that you can catch. That is the people part of that equation. They have to understand that the solution includes them, because if it doesn't include them, they feel like they're being excluded and it is a bad thing for them, right? So that is a really, really good example of that.
So I do want to talk a little bit more about your other research, because you're doing so much really cool research. So what other research are you working on at the moment?
Right now, we have 2 other projects. So one of them is focused on using algae to treat wastewater. And so if those are a lot of words that people aren't really that familiar with, we'll just go into that for a second. But algae are basically organisms. They're plant-like organisms that live in the water, and they have evolved a very long time ago. And they have this amazing capacity to take up nutrients or chemicals essentially from the water. And some of these chemicals, the algae themselves can become problem. People have probably heard of algal blooms, right? These big dinoflagellate blooms they call red tide, and, causes lots of fish kills and things. And so we know that can be bad. And so you may be saying to yourself, well, why would you study something that's bad with wastewater? Like, why would we want? And what we're trying to do is we utilize the capabilities of these algae to remove those nutrients to actually treat and improve water quality before it goes back to the river. So just a quick primer so that everybody's on the same page here. We pull water from the river in this region, and in many regions of the country, we pull water from a source, usually a river. It's treated, it's sent out to all the homes, people flush it down the toilet, it goes into a sewer system, and it makes its way to a treatment plant where it is then treated, and then it gets discharged back to a river or a lake or an ocean. And so we are putting water back into the system. But when we do so, we need to make sure that water is really clean. In the United States, there are thousands and thousands of wastewater treatment plants, and they are discharging billions of gallons of treated wastewater into our ecosystems, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. The one thing that needs to be improved, if there's any improvements to be made, is that if we could reduce certain types of chemicals that are in there, it would be really beneficial for downstream ecosystems. So if you discharge water from a wastewater plant and it has, say, nitrogen or phosphorus, those are things that you could put on your garden plants and make them grow faster. Well, if that gets into the water, it's going to cause the algae downstream to really get excited, and it's going to grow, and it's going to cause all kinds of problems from that. And we can talk about those ecosystem problems in a minute if you choose. But to take a step back, prevention is the key, right? So if we could take that wastewater that's coming down those plants, right? You're already flushing it down the toilet, and if we could recapture those nutrients before they get out into the river or into the ocean or wetland or whatever, then we have this capability of not only having those nutrients for use, we can put those back on farmers' fields, we can use them instead of artificial fertilizers on your lawn, and we have the benefit of not putting those nutrients in and causing fish kills downstream or whatever. So that algae research that we're doing is work in collaboration with the Columbus Waterworks, trying to utilize some of their waste stream and trying to test different formations for removing nutrients from that wastewater. The final project is looking at invasive species of aquatic organisms, and most people what are we talking about? These are not alien necessarily, didn't come from another planet, but they do come from other places, and even different places within the United States. So kudzu is a really good example. Most people in this part of the country will know kudzu. If you're from listening outside of this region, you may have heard of other kinds of plants that are either not aquatic or aquatic. We happen to be working with aquatic organisms that can be extremely detrimental. And one of those has to do with crayfish. There are a couple of crayfish species that have been introduced into Europe, for instance, and they basically have caused massive decline of the native crayfishes in Europe when they brought disease and so forth. And so we are working on a project here in the United States on some of these invasive crayfish. They're crayfish from the U.S., but they have moved into new habitats within the U.S. where they never were before, and they're causing all kinds of problems. So those are kind of the three different research areas.
It's hard because those are both so fascinating to me that I don't know what to go into next.
I know. I love them both. I can tell you're super passionate about the algae. And so I definitely want to dive a little bit into that because it's something that we've talked about some on the show. But before we jump into that, I want to say it's funny to think about like crayfish. You know, they're so small, relatively small. And just that they can be so detrimental to the environment is interesting to think of. And did they migrate? Did they come here on their own or were they introduced?
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? So humans shuffle things around. A lot of fishermen, for instance, like to use crayfish for bait. And so they will have them in a bait container. They might have been sold at a local bait store. They were actually collected out of state. They were transferred to this area and then released oftentimes. That's not the only way. We've got some other really good examples of people like to have crayfish in their aquaria. There's this whole aquarius group that basically is really fascinated. There's many different species, almost 400 species in the United States. And so there's a large number of different species. Some of them are extremely colorful and beautiful.
Like the blue ones.
Yes,
they're so beautiful.
Right. Yeah, so amazingly beautiful. There's orange and yellows and all sorts of different species colors. And anyway, so those people will have them in their aquarium, for instance, for a long time, and then maybe they just are cleaning out, it gets out, or they'll release them into local habitats. And so we have found that also. So we get a number of these critters, even possibly from schools, right? A lot of schools, in thinking they're doing the right thing, they'll order some crayfish so they can do these little experiments with their kids in the classroom, and then when that's done, they're like, "Hey, let's be good citizens and take them out and release them into nature." Right?
That hurts my heart.
Yeah. It's not uncommon. We're sort of looking at some of these questions, trying to find out where do we see these exotic crayfish, and are they close to schools? Are they close to access for fishermen and those sorts of things? And we do find there are some associations that are a little disturbing, but.
So now that we've talked a little bit about where they come from, what are the damages that they're causing? Is it in the destruction of local crayfish species? Is it other cascading effects throughout the environment? What is the issue?
So it depends on the crayfish that's being introduced. In the case of some of the crayfish in Europe, they were spreading a disease which was killing other crayfish. They do play different ecosystem roles. There are crayfish that live basically in the mud underground. They dig holes. They're called burrowing crayfish. Those can cause infrastructure problems. So along rivers and dams and any kind of human infrastructure, they can dig holes in it that can weaken those structures and can cause collapse. That has happened numerous times. They're considered important for fisheries, right? Because fish like to eat them, but different species oftentimes they're less vulnerable to the native fishes. The fish don't know what to do with a really huge, aggressive crayfish. So it has direct impacts on, probably the biggest is on other crayfish species. That's really what we call asticologists, those are people who study crayfish, what they're most concerned about.
That's a new word for me.
Yeah.
Asticologist?
Asticologist.
And what's the root of that? Do you know?
I'm not sure, but asticologists, they're doing work around the world on crayfish, and there's a lot of attention for a small group of people who are really passionate about trying to understand the biology and ecology of crayfishes.
That's cool. I think a lot of people would sort of think like a crawdad is a crawdad is a crawdad, right? And that's not true. Different species have different behavior patterns. They have different habitat requirements, and they're going to do different things in that habitat. So if you have a bunch of burrowing crayfish that are now in the river next to your beautiful river home that is parked very close to the river's edge, that could spell some real problems for you.
Absolutely. And there's just a broad range of ecological impacts of shifting these species. But they've been transported to continents that no crayfish ever evolved in or existed. For instance, there are crayfish been introduced into Africa, and there were never any crayfish in Africa except for Madagascar, which there were crayfish in Madagascar. There's just real serious problems like this. And I should also point out that the Southeast, it is the world's highest biodiversity. So there's the most richness of crayfish species is in the Southeast. Tennessee gets the world record right now for the number of species, well over 100 species of crayfish in Tennessee. And so what you might have inferred from that is that there's something special about Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina. And the answer is yes, probably historically, ice sheets but different river systems. So you get the evolution of these different species in different rivers. And that's a big, important piece of our biodiversity that we're not paying as close attention to as we should.
And are those native crayfish or invasive?
No, those are native crayfishes. And what we're trying to do with these, what we're concerned about is that those would be extremely vulnerable. So a crayfish that is only in one or two watersheds, for instance, would be extremely vulnerable to any kind of exotic crayfish introduction.
And tying it back even to what we were talking about previously on the podcast, small watersheds, those first order streams, are the first streams to see human impact. And so if you have this very small localized species of crawfish and they're just in a place that looks like a great place to develop for people, that's not going to turn out well for them. So understanding the biodiversity that we have and preserving as much of it as we can so that we can maintain as much genetic diversity and just the ecosystem services that our species provide is really, really critical to making sure that our ecosystem here keeps ticking the way that it's supposed to.
I think Aldo Leopold had a really good idea when he talked about the conservation ethic, right? I mean, we should treat nature just like you treat your neighbor, right? You wouldn't go into your neighbor and deface their property and do all sorts of horrible things. And I think we have an ethical obligation to make sure that they have the capability of continuing to evolve and go through their process. And so biodiversity loss is a very, very significant problem. And of course, climate change is exacerbating that problem with all the other things that we've talked about.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And I obviously kind of got us in a rabbit hole about the crayfish. So I'm thinking that we do a follow-up episode sometime soon to speak about the algae and maybe even speak with some of your students doing research with you. But just to kind of wrap up today, is there any kind of recommendation that you would give to someone looking to get into this field?
I think it's really important for students to get actively involved. There are so many opportunities at local high schools, elementary schools. There's really great organizations that exist out now. There's all kinds of citizen science opportunities, and I'm a big proponent of that. I think what you find in your backyard is really, really important and can tell incredible stories. And so if I would say anything to folks, I would just say, if you have an interest in water, you have an interest in critters, go out, wade, walk around, catch some stuff, take some pictures. There's a really great website called iNaturalist, which allows you to post pictures of things that you found, and experts like me will help you identify what you've got. You don't have to know what it is. You can post it up there and we can try to help you. And if you sort of nurture that passion in you and your kids, I think you're going to find that you understand nature a lot better, and you're going to find that you're going to want to protect it a lot more. And we need a lot more advocates for nature these days.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been an excellent episode, and I cannot wait to come back here and talk to you more about algae.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We'd love to hear from you. So if you want to reach out, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
We love questions from our listeners, so if you heard something that you want to know more about, be sure to let us know.
If you've got a minute to spare, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts will help other conservation-minded people find the show. We'd really appreciate it.
A big thanks to the people working to protect our planet, and a big thanks to you for listening. Don't forget to tune in next week.